This is 2.4 adaptations of the body system to training. There are many different types of training, and each one of them leads to different adaptations to the body. Some types of training include continuous training, fartlek training for aerobic, plyometrics and weight resistance training, and HIIT training for anaerobic, and circuit and interval training for both anaerobic and aerobic exercise. An athlete performing in a marathon or other aerobic events are likely to want to adapt different things to an anaerobic athlete performing a 100-meter sprint. An aerobic marathon runner is likely to work at a low intensity for a high duration than an anaerobic sprinter who works at a high intensity for a short duration. Aerobic and anaerobic athletes also need to improve specific components of fitness that they need for their event. These are a couple of examples. An example is that a 100-meter sprinter would need to improve their speed and power in order to perform better in a race. In order to improve our bodies for sports, we must use the principles of training and FITT principles, which are the rules we follow to ensure that adaptations take place. Firstly, we have specificity, which is where we make the training specific to the athlete and their position. For example, in a game of netball, a centre player will want to work on their endurance, whereas a goal shooter who only stays in 1/3 of the court is unlikely to need as much endurance, but might want to train more in reaction time. Next, you have individual needs, so that you can make your training specific to the athlete. For example, a 16-year-old sprinter would have a different training program than a 45-year-old sprinter. Progressive overload is gradually increasing the amount you do to improve your fitness without working too hard or injuring yourself. Progressive overload also contains the FITT principles, which help us to successfully improve our fitness. F stands for frequency, so how often you train. I is intensity, which is how hard or how difficult the training is. And lastly, the two T's stand for time, which is how long we spend and how long we train for. And the last T is type, which refers to the type of training we perform. Rest and recovery are the time we allow ourselves to recover and repair the damage that has been caused by training. Lastly, we have reversibility, which is where if we stop training, the adaptations will reverse. So, yeah. And overtraining, which is where we don't rest and recover enough, causing illness or injury. FITT principles are likely to be different for each performer, but also depending on whether they are working anaerobically or aerobically. For example, aerobic athletes such as the Tour de France cyclist or triathletes are likely to train quite frequently at 4 to 5 days a week, but once or twice a day. It is important to rest and recover for at least 2 days a week. It is likely that these triathletes will be working at a low intensity for a rather long duration in order to improve their endurance. Lastly, the type of training that a cyclist and triathlete use are likely to be different. For example, a Tour de France cyclist has different goals to what a triathlete would, and therefore continuous training or fartlek training are going to be the most suitable, whereas a triathlete will want to improve their swimming, cycling and running, therefore they're likely to use circuit training or continuous training, and may train one day just swimming or a little of each every day. The adaptations that an aerobic athlete is likely to try to improve by training are their cardiorespiratory endurance, VO2 max, submaximal endurance, and the lower resting heart rate. For these adaptations to take place, an aerobic athlete will need to spend at least 14 weeks training. For Anaerobic athletes such as 100-meter hurdlers or shot putters, they are likely to also train 4 to 5 times a week, making sure that they get at least 2 days rest. These athletes need to make sure they train in high intensity but low duration training in order to best suit their sport. However, sometimes they may do some endurance training. These athletes are more likely to use plyometric training, weight resistance training, circuit training, or interval training. Circuit training will help the 100-meter hurdler work on their speed, power, and strength in the same training session, whereas the shot putter is likely to use weight resistance training in order to improve just their power and strength. These athletes should train at least 6 weeks to improve the components of fitness. Adaptations that aerobic athletes are likely to train for are an increased resistance to build-up of lactic acid in the muscles and muscular endurance, and a decrease in resting heart rate and oxygen deficit. Anaerobic activities tend to have a mainly explosive nature, whereas whether it's throwing a ball in shot put or jumping over hurdles in a 100-meter race. This means that the athletes are looking to improve their power and strength to improve their explosive actions. For example, the more strength and power a shot putter has, the further they are likely to throw, and the more power a hurdler has, the easier they'll be able to clear the hurdles. These athletes will also train to improve their reaction time, high force output, and a lower fatigue rate. These values can increase the athlete's chance in performing the activity in the most efficient time. For example, the hurdler will need a fast reaction time to the starting pistol in order to start the race as quickly as possible and stop the chances of decreasing the time because of a slow start. When training anaerobically, we tend to use HIIT training, which is high intensity interval training. This is where we split our training into bursts of high intensity exercise with the rest between each burst. Because of the nature of this type of training, it will have both long and short-term adaptations to the cardiovascular system. Some of these short-term adaptations include an increased heart rate and cardiac output, allowing oxygen already in the blood to reach the working muscles faster. This is during exercise. However, long-term adaptations to the cardiovascular system because of anaerobic training include a lower resting heart rate, hypertrophy of the heart, and an increase in stroke volume. The training causes the myocardium of the heart to work hard, causing it to increase in size and strength. This is known as hypertrophy. Hypertrophy also causes the heart stroke volume to increase because the heart becomes more comfortable contracting harder due to its increased size and shape. Your resting heart rate also decreases because of the hypertrophy. The increase of these are important for the improvement of the athlete's performance because it means the heart rate range becomes larger and the athlete's fatigue will be delayed. This graph shows us the heart rate before and after a 20-second anaerobic Wingate test. We know that this athlete was a 16-year-old, meaning that their maximum heart rate was 204 BPM, and that their resting was 85, meaning that they have a heart rate range of 119. This graph shows us how quickly and rapidly an athlete's heart rate can increase during a bout of anaerobic activity. We can see that this athlete's heart rate had an anticipatory rise beforehand as it increased from 85 to 115. From here, we can see that the athlete's heart rate values have rapidly increased from 115 to 163 in around 20 seconds. For an athlete to be working anaerobically, their heart rate must be over 80% of their maximum heart rate, which is the anaerobic threshold. For this athlete, their anaerobic threshold was 363 BPM, and as we can see from the graph, they were working at 363 BPM, showing that they were working in their anaerobic. They were working anaerobically. Just like the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system also has long and short-term adaptations to exercise. During HIIT training, our breathing rate is unlikely to increase gently due to the anaerobic, meaning no oxygen, nature of exercise. However, post-exercise, we would expect to see the athlete's breathing rate increase due to the body repaying oxygen depth. Some long-term adaptations we may see include an increased stroke volume and ventilation at rest, and a decrease in breathing rate at rest. Due to this increased stroke volume, which is the volume of air moved per breath, we no longer have to breathe as often, as we are moving a larger volume of air less often than before. The graph on the left shows your oxygen deficit and EPOC, which is your excess post-exercise oxygen consumption value. Oxygen deficit is always there in anaerobic activities because the athletes do not use oxygen. However, an anaerobic athlete will want to recover quickly, meaning that if their tidal volume increases, they can perform more efficient alveolar ventilation, and their EPOC will decrease. However, the graph on the right shows our athlete's breathing rate when performing a 20-second Wingate test. We can see that again the athlete has an anticipatory rise as their breathing rate has increased from 12 to 16. We can also see that post-test the athlete's breathing rate has increased even further to 27, showing that their breathing rate has increased to try and recover from the lack of oxygen during exercise and to help break down lactic acid that's been built up in the muscle.